Is there a PIN number on the? That's weird. Oh, okay. Off to a hot start. All right. All right, everyone, good evening. It's good to see everybody. So we are in chapter 11 this week in the book of Ecclesiastes, and we're coming down to our last few weeks. We just have this week and next, and we've spent quite a bit of time throughout this book, and maybe I've spent a lot of time sort of lecturing and and ranting, I guess, but we've seen kind of a lot of repeated points throughout this book and repeated themes that have either been repackaged and told and written in a different way by Solomon, but all tied to two or three general themes and really one underlying principle of the entire book. And it's Solomon's quest to find meaning in his particular life throughout in the early parts of this book, making the strong and obvious claim that that all of the things on this earth in this life are meaningless and vain, and he begins to make the distinction of the under the sun versus above the sun premise, and that's kind of what we've time and time again have gone over and talked about, looking at different circumstances and different examples that are provided. But again, tying back to the same general theme. So as we get into chapter 11, kind of as a review of last week, Solomon is sort of directing his writings and his theme in the last few chapters of really contrasting living in a wise fashion versus a foolish fashion, and how a wise person would live and how a foolish person would live, and is really counseling the reader to consider and look at the two. And it's all based on what he has observed in his life and his findings. So that theme continues on as we keep going in chapter 11. So we start in verse 1. He says, "Cast your bread on the surface of the waters, for you will find it many days after. Divide your portion into 7, or even to 8, for you do not know what misfortune may occur on the earth." So, kind of interesting way to put it. Cast your bread on the surface of the waters. When we read that verse, what is he getting at here in verse 1 when he says, "Cast your bread, cast your belongings out on the water"? Ian.
For what it's worth, I have a bit different translation. It says, "Send your grain overseas, where after many days you will get a return." So perhaps that's what it's driving at, especially in light of the theme in the verses that follow about working hard, diversifying your efforts, and doing something along those lines.
Certainly, at face value, certainly it's a kind of an economic, business theme of that time. Casting your grain across the seas may have been seen as a pretty risky a pretty risky investment or business move in that sense. But saying that his advice is to do that for your reward and your return, you will not see till many days later. So certainly, from a economic standpoint, that's certainly true. In verse 2, the same sort of theme applies. Divide your portion into 7 to 8, and plan for the misfortune that may come. Kind of immediately, like I said, when you look at it, it's really the general theme of, you could look at it from an economic standpoint, but the wise person here, and continuing with what he's talking about, contrast between wisdom and folly, the wise person is willing to work or maybe even take a risk or consider something that's not immediately seen, or the gain or the return is not immediately realized. The other way to kind of look at that is kind of one thing I was considering is just giving generously and being able to cast your bread out amongst the seas. You can almost look at that as being willing to let go of your possessions and have a generous heart and cast it to those who may need it. Really, verse 2, his point is really just considering the risks ahead. You can look at it, like I said, from a standpoint of an economic standpoint, but just how, from a spiritual context, how we approach our lives as Christians, certainly these themes apply. So, if there's any other comments, let's continue. So in verse 3, he says, if the clouds are full, they pour out rain upon the earth. And whether a tree falls towards the south or toward the north, wherever the tree falls, there it lies. He who watches the wind will not sow, and he who looks at the clouds will not reap. It's kind of an interesting verse 3. Just wherever a tree falls, there it lies. If there's rain clouds coming, it will rain. Kind of a blatant, sort of obvious, dry statement there. What do we think he's trying to get at when he writes a statement like that? Dallas. Oh, no. I do the same thing. Ian.
Why this idea of working and trying to make a living? There's randomness that occurs in the world that we have zero control over. So he's going to explain it a little bit better in the following verses. So you shouldn't always look for the perfect opportunity. Things are going to happen. It might be rain, a tree might fall down, might be sunshine. Anything that can happen can happen. So instead, look for the opportunities all the time, as opposed to waiting for them, especially by this randomness.
Yeah. No, it's the randomness point is one that we've already talked about a few times. It's a point that he repeatedly brings to light, and I think it's important to consider. And like you say, he'll go on and explain a little bit more in detail further in the chapter. But also, kind of just a general takeaway is trees falling, rain clouds, weather, natural disasters, whatever you want to call it. Also tying into the general theme that he's pointed out several times throughout the book of the fact that there are forces in this world, in this earth, that are just completely out of our control. And that, of course, is one of the main factors of the randomness of life. But it's not our duty, and it's not our quest to try to explain or rationalize those things in our life and why exactly they happen. It's more so the wise person, or one who truly wants to follow God and make peace with these things, does just that, is makes peace with the reality that there is a large portion of the things that are around us in this world that are just completely out of our control. And consequently, if one who's able to do that, the wise person who's able to do that, you could almost, hear him saying, instead of procrastinating, being paralyzed by fear, or just being stricken, pursue what is ahead and make peace with those things in your life. Be okay with the fact that some of those things may happen to you in your life in the future, and you don't even know what they will be and when they will happen. And it's not just natural disasters. You can stretch this out to a much greater theme, like we've talked about several times in this class, of just random, unexplainable tragedies in one's life. You live long enough and you get to know enough people, you come to find out that just about everyone has experienced such things in one context or another. And it sort of humbles you a little bit, because when something like this happens to you, in whatever context it may be, you tend to think of it in a vacuum, or at least I'm maybe speaking for myself. You tend to think about it in a vacuum, maybe in a bit, and you tend to get sucked into a pretty pessimistic and doomed mentality, which is kind of the theme of Solomon's writings early in the book. And getting sucked into that, you can really get sucked in the mentality of the under the sun approach to life. The one or the foolish person who has not made peace with those things, who can't accept the fact that this has happened to him. So my point being is, if you live long enough and you spend time sharing those things with others and getting to know, other people's incidences of random tragedies in this world, that's a broad description. It sort of humbles you a little bit and makes you realize, why not you? I kind of had somebody tell me that one time. If something bad happens to you and you sort of just feel victimized, the natural approach of a friend or somebody would be to come to you and support you, and certainly that's a good thing. But one time I had somebody tell me well, why not you? What makes you so special? And it kind of, took me back a minute, kind of like, well, I wasn't expecting really you to say that. I was kind of expecting some emotional support here. But, you leave and you wake up the next day and you really think about that. And sort of the dryness and bluntness of that statement ties in with a lot of really what Solomon says in this book is, hey, why not you? And maybe I'm kind of expanding a little bit here, but a lot of these themes are repeated throughout the book. And in a simple statement of, as simple as, oh, okay, if the clouds are full, it's going to rain. If a tree blows over from the wind, it's going to fall. And that's how it is. His point, though, he who watches the wind, waits for something to blow over or looks at the clouds, they'll be paralyzed. Like in a farmer's, if you're looking at it from an agricultural standpoint, if you're waiting for the perfect weather to, operate your farming operation in, like that, you're never going to plant, you're never going to harvest. It's just kind of something in the context of my job. You just learn to adapt and be flexible, and realize that some years are better than others. Like that's just the ultimate theme that he's trying to get at here. But from a spiritual context, it certainly applies that us as Christians today, just because we are in Christ and we have been saved and we are able to make peace with that tremendous grace and tremendous blessing, does not exempt us from these things happening in our life. And one can either make peace with that, or one can either be stricken by fear from that reality. So, Mitch.
I was thinking about is just the randomness of change in the world. And if you're just under the sun and that's all there is, that's a life that's very frustrating. This life is random and life changes. So you have to sit with that and just accept it. It's hard, but that's all there is.
Yeah, and I'm not sitting up here advocating that, just because one has made peace with this, that it's as simple as a tragedy happens. Oh, I knew this was going to happen. The emotional outpour is not so black and white, and there is, of course, we feel all the effects of these things happening, and it's on us as Christians to be able to handle those emotions and handle those times of shock and grief, disappointment, or just ruts in our life, whatever it may be, and come out the other end of it. It may be a struggle, but sadly, as you're saying, Mitch, the folks in this world that don't have that source of that rock to draw on, as far as a life above the sun and with Christ, it can spit you in a million different directions, and anger and depression and doubling down on whatever it is, a million different things. And we've talked about it a couple different times in this class, but it's interesting throughout this book how Solomon boils down his thoughts and writes down just short little verses in these chapters and packages them in different ways, but all sort of tie back to the same theme. So if we're repeating a lot of statements in here, it's obviously not by coincidence. So, Randy.
I'm reminded of the one talent man in Matthew 25, where he just, rather than doing what he should do, tries to help his talent grow. He puts it in a hole and lives a protective way. And I think that's part of what's being discussed here, is don't try to control everything. And you guys have already alluded to that. And that's what he was trying to do. I'm fearful of what might happen. Well, cast your blood on the water.
Yeah, certainly with the man with the one talent is, he was maybe more so focused on just protecting that one thing and not interested in really challenging himself, really growing. I mean, it's talking about in that verse, in verse 4, it's talking about will not reap. So the goal is to reap something in a spiritual context, to reap, to grow, to expand your faith. And if one is just to sort of sit idle in their faith and their routine and the way of doing things, New Testament, Old Testament, Solomon's teachings, Christ's teachings, that's not something I think is acceptable. And so we as Christians really have to make peace with the understanding that twofold, that there is randomness in life and bad things will happen to us, but the point of those things happening will also in the end will create some sort of spiritual growth. And that in and of itself allows us to have that peace. All right, so let's keep moving. Okay, so verse 5, he says, just as you do not know the path of the wind and how bones are formed in the womb of a pregnant woman, so you do not know the activity of God who makes all things. So, again, a common theme that Solomon has pointed out. He's made clear that God is in control, God is all powerful, and it's not really up to man to try to fully understand that. I'm reminded of Jesus' statement and his conversation he has with Nicodemus in John chapter 3, and Nicodemus is sort of blown away by the news and the things that he's hearing about this Jesus man, and requests to meet with him, and Jesus tells him and starts explaining, one must be born again, one must be born of water and spirit, and one must be born again, and Nicodemus is just, sort of paraphrasing, but just can't comprehend this and can't understand it, even to the point where he says, I don't understand, is one supposed to be born again through their mother's womb? And Jesus makes this statement of saying, the wind blows where it wishes and you hear the sound of it, but cannot tell where it comes from and where it goes. So is everyone who is born of the Spirit. And Jesus later goes on and tells Nicodemus that, you don't even believe the earthly accounts or the things that we talk about him and his disciples that we witness. How would you believe any heavenly things that I tell you? And uses the example of, some of he says, you're a great teacher of Israel, and don't you believe and have faith of the great things that happened of our forefathers in the Old Testament? But Jesus making that point of really it's the way this world works and God's creation and the powers that are above us is not really up for us to understand. And again, that concept of making peace with that. And there's so many in our culture today who obsess over trying to find the answers of the world's origin or how things work. It even says here that, I could picture somebody saying, well, this verse is nullified. We know exactly how bones are formed in a pregnant woman. Maybe so. Maybe you know the process exactly of how it scientifically develops, but you don't know exactly how and why. And that's a very deep question. And that's just one thing. There are thousands of things, millions of things about this universe that are just explained and boiled down into, the magic word theory that tends to change every 5 to 10 years with a new study. So there's no real solid answer from the under the sun perspective is the point. But saying, just how you don't know that the wind blows and borns are formed in a woman's womb, you don't know all the activity of God, and it's not up to you really to understand that completely. Dana.
Do you think he's saying that you don't know these things and not just like information, you don't have that information, but you're supposed to trust me, live the way you're supposed to live, and understand that you don't understand, and that's okay.
Well, that certainly that theme of trust ties into the next verse. But, we can never fully understand the mysteries of God, but, it's fun to let your mind sort of wonder. And, there's a million reasons why, I guess, that this universe and this world that's created in and of itself, is so spectacular. But to me, it's the ultimate, like Solomon's reminding us again of the limitations of human knowledge. Well, to me, that reminder is what it serves as me as a humbling fact. The fact that, my goodness, there is something so beyond me and my struggles and what I'm dealing with on this earth. Now that's pretty humbling to me. And then you get into the thought of that is a God that actually loves me, who cares about me, who saved me, this sort of thing. But just that starting factor of just the humbleness that comes of just, my goodness, I'm just a speck on this earth. And certainly with my knowledge and understanding of how it even works. So, let's move on. Okay, verse 6. So he says, sow your seed in the morning, and do not be idle in the evening, for you do not know whether morning or evening sowing will succeed, or whether both of them alike will be good. So, playing off that, the previous verses, and accepting the realities of life, being at peace with the things that may happen, relinquishing the desire to try to understand everything, and trusting in God. Well, ultimately, the way one does that is true trusting, as Dan is saying, is not a passive, state of inactivity. It's with true faith. Faith is realized in action. You can believe in God and trust in God, but ultimately seeing that through is with how we decide to act and what kind of actions we decide to take. And just the thing I'm reminded of is the story of Abraham. When God calls him to leave his land and go to a place that he does not know. It's such a simple story, but just understand the context and really what that means. That is kind of what we're being asked to do as Christians, is to turn away our lives from this world and go down a path of following Christ that, as Solomon is explaining, is going to have hurdles and troubles in our lives in the future, and we don't fully know where that's going to go, or how things are going to play out, and what our life will look like in 5-10 years. But we trust in God. We trust the fact that even if this life doesn't live up to what my expectations are, I'm not really living for this life. So, displaying that trust in God is one who will sow in the morning, sow at night, and constantly be working and looking for every opportunity. Certainly in a career, economic, labor standpoint, this is a good proverb, good piece of advice to just kind of work your tail off and continue to grind and find anything you can improve at. Not be afraid to work on your weaknesses. But from a spiritual standpoint, I go backwards. But from a spiritual standpoint, how I see it is the wise person is willing to display that trust in God in all areas of their life, and sow and reap. And when he says morning and night, the theme there is covering all parts of your day, or covering all parts of your routine or your life schedule, however you want to call it. And yes, he's kind of going on the theme, cast your bread out, divide your portions, mitigate your risks. There's, in this, sow at night, sow in the morning. You never know which one will succeed. You'll never know where you might get a bountiful harvest. Those are all true statements in a economic, like I said, career, under the sun perspective. But trying to look at this from a spiritual perspective as well. So let's keep moving. Okay, so verse 7 says, "The light is pleasant, and it is good for the eyes to see the sun. Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice and live in them all. And let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility." So in verse 7, just kind of, Solomon, it's kind of, to me, this is kind of the ultimate point that he gets at of real balance in one's life. He's made the point a few times throughout this book that God permits us to enjoy the things of this world. And when I think of, he says, the light is pleasant, it's good for your eyes to see the sun. It's good to be outside, it's good to be active, it's good to enjoy your life and get out and pursue these things. And says, indeed, if someone is going to live for many years, he is to rejoice in those days and be thankful and value every one of those days that one receives. But kind of the ultimate point there is like what we've been saying is remember the dark days, or remember the struggles that are to come. I don't think he says this in a way that's meant to, again, be pessimistic or discourage someone. It's kind of the ultimate balance that Solomon brings to this book, and as he's writing, as someone who should be wise, someone who's sober-minded can find a way to live and enjoy the good things of this life, but understand that can change, and not get too high and not get too low, essentially. And then kind of at the end there, he says, that last sentence, everything that is to come will be futility. So when he says everything, he's talking about the pleasant, light-filled days, the days that you may rejoice in, and then the dark days. And we've made this point before that kind of putting the bow statement on it of, doesn't matter really what happens to you, it matters how you react. That's probably not the best thing to say to somebody after they've experienced a terrible tragedy, but kind of somebody like telling you, hey, why not you? And but the truth of that eventually percolates and should penetrate your heart. And that's Solomon's blunt way of saying that, of saying, hey, you can enjoy these days, and remember to balance out and consider and remember the tough days that will come. But actually, the whole point of this book, I hate to spoil your thought here, but it's actually all vain. And don't forget, when he says that, he's really saying, don't forget why I'm saying this is all vain. And don't forget that your true life and your true purpose is to be living and looking past these days, whether good or bad. Enjoy them. Don't get too high, don't get too low. Understand what's going to come. Understand that there's a time for everything. But have the wisdom to be able to say that this is all vanity. Not in the sense in the beginning of the book where it was very pessimistic, very almost sarcastic and kind of depressing, kind of mocking all the people of this earth that, under the sun, that are either in power, rich, have great pleasures, even mocking himself. To me, ironically, the most encouraging statement he's making there towards the end of this book is remember that all of this actually doesn't matter, in the sense that it can't touch your soul and it can't touch your spirit. You are to be living past these days. So, Larry.
I'm not sure if the writer is mocking or sarcastic. I think that's putting a value on his things that he doesn't necessarily say
maybe, yeah, no, maybe that's probably more of what I'm getting at is, someone who reads this book, I guess from the under the sun perspective, might read that as a kind of almost some of his statements earlier in this book of calling out the vanity of one's life under the sun, find it sort of offensive, sarcastic, whatever you might in that context. But no, you're correct. He's totally right, and it's a hard truth in what he's saying. But ultimately, maybe someone might interpret it that way. Maybe is what I'm getting at. So, okay, well, did it again. We're moving through pretty quick. So we got our last two verses here. So, okay, in verse 9, so he wraps up this chapter by saying, "Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things. So remove grief and anger from your heart, and put away the pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting." So again, Solomon providing kind of the balance of these two themes that he's sort of led up to this point, and talking about how we are to enjoy and to go after and pursue the things of this world with energy and with zeal, and specifically in this topic, he's talking about a young man, a young person in the prime of their life, the prime of their energy. Pursue those things and pursue what the strengths and the things you're able to take advantage of in your life. He even says, pursue your impulses and desires of your heart and eyes. And if you were to cut the end of verse 9 there off and leave that last sentence out, that would almost be, he'd be promoting being a total sinner and a hedonist in that point. But balances out and as the reminder of do those things, have that energy, have that zeal for life here and making the most of your time on this vain earth, but do that remembering always, and he'll really get into that word remembering in chapter 12, but remember that God will bring all these things and whatever you do during that time of your life into judgment. And kind of in verse 10 as he wraps it up, he just says, put away the pain, sort of the anguish of this life, but makes that point in talking specifically to to young people, young man, young woman, that take advantage of this time and don't essentially abuse your body, abuse this time of your life, because it will not last long. And you can almost see Solomon sort of reflecting as an old man in the time in his life when he was younger, and having some regrets and wishing that maybe he had lived not so hard in the fast lane maybe, or took time to dedicate that energy of youthfulness maybe more towards the things that please God. So there's no final comments. That's kind of all I have tonight. We'll finish up next week in chapter 12. There's Justin.
I appreciate that verse, like the idea of follow your heart is very much worldly wisdom in and of itself. That's what the society around us preaches, just follow your heart, and I appreciate the caution and the wisdom in that verse. Like, okay, yeah, follow your heart, but don't lose your mind and your morality. Like, you're going to be judged, at some point for your actions. So, follow your heart within reason.
Well, certainly, and you could even just think of that in the context of absolutely follow your heart and follow your desires and follow your path in life that you really want to go after if it's set on God. Follow your heart, follow the heart that's set on God's own will. And think about Solomon's father, David. that theme that carried on is several times throughout this book, Solomon has called out worldly activities in this world and has made a distinction that the activities here in and of themselves aren't sinful. It's how we use or go about doing the things in this world, either for God or for ourselves. And certainly following your heart, a heart set on God, absolutely it should be pursued with desire and energy.
I forget where it is I think in Proverbs, but the caution is guard your heart by comparison.
Guard your heart. Totally, yeah. Thought I saw one more. Oh, Mitch.
Just going back to verses 1 through 6, and just rereading those, I kind of see a real
Oh, 1 through 6.
theme of faith. Just kind of going back to that, maybe just in a spiritual sense, right? So casting your bread on waters or dividing your portion. So, whether that's economic or whether it's generosity, I mean, we can kind of look at it a couple different ways. But that's counterintuitive. I don't want to get my bread on water, and I'm going to divide up everything I have and keep what I have, right? And that way, it's mine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to invest myself, and what that takes is faith. Right? I have to do what's sort of counterintuitive and ask those things and divide them. And then going back to what maybe is intuitive under the sun, as clouds are full of rain, see clouds when they're going to rain, and the wind, trees are going to fall. And so you're going to watch that and try to time everything. And just as we don't know how the body's formed in the womb, we don't know how God works, right? And so we think we can predict, and I'll hold my things, I'll do these things, and I'll do it all based on the faith I have in myself. And it's like a faith that you have in God, where you do these things. You invest in generosity, you invest in other ways through faith, and then it culminates in verse 6, sow your seed in the morning and the evening. You don't know whether both of them will be alike or good. And so we always think that, well, it's this time is what's good.
Yeah.
God's saying, with inspiration, I kind of feel like it's all the time is good.
Yeah.
It's always good, but all that takes faith. And that's very counterintuitive to what the world presents.
That's the word. I was going to say that's the word that sticks out to me as counterintuitive. Counterintuitive. That, I don't know, in a way you could almost make the parallel that being a Christian is in and of itself is counterintuitive, and that's sort of a lot of the themes that he's pointing out here in this book. That the wise person, the one who's truly going to set their heart on God and keep His commandments, the wise person tends to do things in a counterintuitive way that the world or the under the sun perspective person would see them. Things like casting your bread out on the waters, whatever it may be, giving in a way that's so generous that other people might think you're just wasting your bread type. But approaching generosity in the way where you realize where that bread comes from, and you realize that it's ultimately vain, and you realize, well, maybe I've been blessed, and while the time I have on this earth, I can use it in a generous way and use it to bless somebody else. And so, but that word counterintuitive, maybe think about that and sort of let that sink into the overarching themes that Solomon's talking about here, above the sun, below the sun, a wise person, a foolish person, and then, counterintuitive and what that means as a Christian. Really, ultimately, when you're choosing to follow Christ, you're ultimately choosing a counterintuitive life compared to the under the sun perspective. And Solomon's telling us here to keep that in mind. So ultimately, we've got one more week left, one more chapter, and we'll wrap up. So that's all I have. Thanks, everyone.